And when free speech dies, it's not long before free thought dies, and then creativity, and then invention and innovation, all of them strangled. And that is why autocratic regimes of the sort I've been describing become famous, not merely for their authoritarian tendencies, but for their total stupidity. You don't see people turning to North Korea, Myanmar, or Zimbabwe for new ideas and innovations. Regimes and organizations that follow this route are not headed for excellence. No, they're on the fast track toward decline and failure. And how much discipline, how much policing, how much repression are necessary to eliminate free speech and legitimate self-government are the benchmarks for how quickly the decline will unfold. I love that word, benchmarks. One of the most insidious varieties of autocratic rule involves the use of informers in everyday life. In the Soviet Union, for example, children were urged to inform on their parents and students to rat on their professors if they heard them discussing forbidden issues in the home or the classroom. The most gruesome picture of this is provided in the great book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago. He wrote, "It's difficult to school oneself, to ask that constant question, who is the stool pigeon among us? In our apartment, in our courtyard, in our watch repair shop, in our school, in our design bureau. It is difficult to school oneself, and it is repulsive to become schooled. But for safety, one must." And Solzhenitsyn was himself imprisoned in the Gulag for 8 years, and then held in internal exile. And I believe he was charged with the crime of unprofessional conduct. I'd have to check the facts on that. In a later case in the Soviet Union, a noted physicist of all things, ran into some trouble. To paraphrase a message given to him by the state, "You're welcome to do your research and your science, but when it comes to criticizing great leader, we're finding fault with our glorious regime. Just watch out, Dr. Sakharov." In 1980, after protesting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Sakharov, probably the most brilliant scientist of his generation, was forced into internal exile in the closed city of Gorky. And as I recall, he was charged with the crime of unprofessional conduct. It might have been something else. In his famous study of the German people following World War II, the American social critic Milton Mayer found that many of the people he interviewed scarcely noticed that their society had been taken over by a brutal totalitarian ruler. They were contented. They went about their lives. They did their work. They did their research. They enjoyed their families. And yes, they noticed that the synagogue had burned down and that their Jewish neighbors had moved away, but they remained silent, and life was good. They had a great leader, and the leader had a plan. Everything seemed wonderful. Everything seemed just fine until that horrible war broke out. The title of Milton Mayer's book, as you can see, is "They Thought They Were Free." Now, I will not continue with this list of benchmarks of autocratic governance. For the specifics, you can read books on modern political history or consult your local listings. And I will not have time to discuss specific strategies for change. But I'd like to conclude with 2 points of recognition that may be helpful in efforts to restore democracy. first point might be called the Niemöller principle. It stems from the life of Martin Niemöller, a Protestant pastor in Germany who supported Hitler in the early years of the Nazis' rise to power, but later came to see what was going wrong and protested. And he was imprisoned in Sachsenhausen concentration. There's his cell in Sachsenhausen. And after the war, he said this: first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I was not a communist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me. And by that time, there was no one left to speak up. And although Niemöller himself did not state the lesson as a principle, I would summarize it as follows. Next. If you see them doing it to somebody else, don't think they won't do it to you. And this suggests a need to recognize one's connections to the plight of others and one's solidarity with them. Poor Niemöller got the point after he had been shipped off to the concentration camp. By the way, I'm pretty sure his crime was that of unprofessional conduct. Well, once again, it often happens that people watch democracy literally evaporate before their very eyes, and they say, well, that's of no concern to me. I have my work. I have my research. I'm going to get a good job. I'm not involved with all of this. And I believe it was Patrick Henry who once said, give me liberty, or maybe a research center and a few grants. Maybe I don't have that quote exactly right. But even for those of you who simply want to get on with your work in your lives, there's another point of recognition. It's a malady to which even good rulers often fall prey. The historian Barbara Tuchman calls it the march of folly. In her book by that title, she looks at societies that launched catastrophic wars or pursued disastrous policies, tenaciously persisting in them to the bitter end, even when the results were clearly contrary to their self-interest. And she calls this mindset that produces outcomes of this kind wooden-headedness. Thank God we don't have any wars like that now. And if you read the daily paper, the New York Times, or for that matter, the Polytechnic, you'll find ample evidence that the march of folly continues to this day. But fortunately, we are not helpless. Next slide. Barbara Tuchman spells out a suggestion. She writes, if the mind is open enough to perceive that a given policy is harming rather than serving self-interest, and self-confident enough to acknowledge it and wise enough to reverse it, that is the summit of the art of government. How wonderfully sensible. Why not give it a try? Well, I hope this has been an educational experience for you. We've discussed some important concepts: flunky, Quisling, stool pigeon, and we've covered some important historical principles. And I want to thank you for participating in this presentation with me, even though, as you probably noticed, we've sometimes stumbled perilously close to the brink of unprofessional conduct. Thank you.